in the sprawling rain-slicked metropolis, where the skyscrapers clawed at a bruised and weeping sky, a single, solitary figure stood at the edge of a rooftop. He was an artist, a creator of worlds, once hailed as a visionary, his name whispered in the hallowed halls of galleries and the hushed tones of critics. Now, his name was a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered with pity. His bank account was a void, his relationships were smoldering ruins, and the canvases that once sang with vibrant life now stood stacked against his loft's walls, their colors seeming to have bled out into the grayness of his existence. His final project, a monument to his talent, had been a catastrophic failure, a public implosion that had left his reputation in tatters, his spirit fractured into 1,000 jagged shards. The city lights below blurred into a smear of indifferent neon, mocking his solitude. This wasn't just a fall from grace. It was a complete and utter annihilation of self. He was no longer the artist. He was the ruin. Yet in the profound silence of that abyss, something unexpected stirred. It wasn't hope, not at first. It was anger, a raw primal, and volcanic defiance against the universe that had so thoroughly rejected him. It was the spark of a man with nothing left to lose. He took a step back from the edge, not towards safety, but towards a different kind of precipice. He decided not to end his story, but to rewrite it from the ashes. He began to build not with paint, but with a brutal, unforgiving honesty. He started by looking into the shattered mirror of his life and confronting the person responsible. He forced himself to see his arrogance, his carelessness, his reliance on a borrowed light that had finally gone out. He had to find out if there was any resilience left in the hollowed out shell of his heart. This was not a path to redemption. It was a war for survival, a war he was determined to win. His journey began in squalor, moving from a sun-drenched loft to a cramped basement studio that smelled of damp and decay. The walls were bare, the only light coming from a single, naked bulb. It was in this tomb that he started his true work. The tools were not brushes and paint, but scraps of metal, discarded wood, and broken electronics he fished from dumpsters. He was no longer an artist, he was an alchemist, transmuting trash into testament. He worked with a desperate fury, his fingers raw and bleeding, his nights sleepless. It was in this brutal, unglamorous existence that he discovered the first pillar of his new self, the relentless power of showing up. He learned that genius was not a lightning strike of inspiration, but the slow, agonizing drip of water that carves canyons. His new masterpiece was a chaotic sculpture built from the ruins of a forgotten city, and with every piece of refuse he welded into place, he was welding the fractured pieces of his own soul back together. The path was never linear, paved with agonizing failures and crippling setbacks. After months of grueling work, he lost his crudely built studio, evicted for unpaid rent, and his life's work, the sculpture, was unceremoniously dumped into a landfill. He stood in the rain, watching a bulldozer bury his heart and soul. The pain was indescribable, a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical wound. He could have surrendered then, accepted the universe's final, crushing verdict. But he had learned a new lesson in the ashes of his old self. Resilience isn't a shield that stops the blows, but a muscle that rebuilds itself, stronger and more resolute after each devastating impact. He didn't just rebuild, he redefined. He started using the very concept of loss as his new medium, creating art from memories, from the ache of absence, from the haunting beauty of things that were no longer there. He found a new, profound power in vulnerability, and his art began to resonate with a raw, authentic truth that fame had never given him. This relentless, obsessive pursuit of his craft eventually led him to a new light. A small, avant-garde gallery in a forgotten part of the city, run by a woman who saw past the has-been label and recognized the phoenix rising from the rust. The night of his first showing in this new life was not filled with champagne and admirers. The gallery was cramped and dimly lit, the audience sparse and skeptical. But he stood beside his creations, sculptures born of refuse and loss, paintings that bled with raw emotion. And for the first time in his life, he was not performing. He was simply being. He was the embodiment of his struggle, a living testament to the idea that the greatest masterpiece one can ever create is the reconstruction of a broken self. As he watched a single critic, a man who had once publicly lambasted him, stand mesmerized before a piece, tears glistening in his eyes, the artist understood his final truth. The external triumph, the recognition, the applause. It was all just an echo. The real victory was the one he had fought for in the dark alone, when no one was watching. The triumph was in the choice to stay, to fight, to bend without breaking, and to find the strength not in the summit, but in the arduous, unrelenting climb. The descent and the decision, the protagonist's complete professional and personal ruin, culminating in a moment of suicidal contemplation on a rooftop. The turning point is his decision to not jump, but to fight, fueled by a spark of defiance and the start of self-confrontation. The gutter and the grind after the fall, he begins his reconstruction in a squalid basement studio. He finds a new form of expression using discarded materials, discovering the foundational principle of discipline and showing up, transforming his creative process into a tool for mental survival. The second annihilation, he loses his new studio and his life's work is unceremoniously destroyed in a landfill. This is a crushing, heartbreaking blow that tests his newfound resilience to its absolute limit. The turning point is his choice to not give up after this ultimate loss, but to use it as a catalyst for an even more profound level of art and self-understanding. The new dawn, a small, unconventional gallery owner offers him a chance. This represents the first external validation of his new path and a crucial test of his identity. The turning point is his willingness to step into the light, not with the arrogance of his former self, but with the humble, raw authenticity of the man he has become. The silent summit, the night of the gallery showing. He experiences a moment of profound external recognition, but the true turning point is an internal one. He realizes that the real triumph is not in the validation of others, but in the arduous, private journey of self-reconstruction. It's the moment he solidifies his new identity, finding the victory within the struggle itself. The city was a symphony of indifference, a sprawling, concrete leviathan that had never known his name and would not mourn his absence. It hummed with the relentless energy of millions of lives colliding, a chaotic tapestry of ambition and despair that he could no longer find a thread in. Marcus Thorne stood on the edge of his own personal apocalypse, the wind whipping his once immaculate coat around his gaunt frame like a shroud. The sky was a bruised, tumultuous expanse of slate, gray and deep, angry purple, pregnant with a storm that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for him to make a decision. 20 stories below, the life of the city continued its indifferent flow, a river of headlights and hurried pedestrians, each one blissfully unaware of the silent drama unfolding on the precipice above. This was not a dramatic, movie scene moment where he was contemplating a jump after a single tragedy. This was the culmination of a slow, agonizing erosion, a decade-long drought that had finally cracked the very bedrock of his soul. He was an artist, once celebrated, now a punchline. His canvases, which had once sold for sums that could buy a small island, were now gathering dust in a storage unit he couldn't afford, their vibrant colors seeming to mock him with memories of a life that belonged to someone else. The critics, who had once called him a visionary, now used his name as a synonym for hubris and spectacular failure. The final, crushing blow had been the Inferno exhibition, a project that was supposed to be his magnum opus, a fiery rebirth from a period of personal turmoil. Instead, it had been a public immolation. The reviews were scathing, not just in their criticism, but in their cruel personal delight. They spoke of a man who had lost his touch, his vision, his very soul. It was as if they had been waiting for him to fall, and when he did, they were eager to dance on the ashes. But the professional ruin was merely the final nail in the coffin. The coffin itself had been built long before, brick by heavy brick, by his own hands. The path to this rooftop was paved with a lifetime of poor choices, a litany of burned bridges and neglected relationships. His marriage, the one anchor in his chaotic life, had been the first casualty of his relentless ambition. He had loved Alina with a desperate, consuming passion, but he had loved his art more. He had sacrificed their time together on the altar of his creativity, spending weeks, sometimes months, locked away in his studio, believing that his genius was a sacred fire that could not be interrupted. He had missed anniversaries, birthdays, and finally, the quiet soul-crushing moments of a marriage dying of neglect. He had watched her leave, taking the warmth and the laughter with her, the silence in the house, after she was gone, a far more damning indictment than any scathing review. He had filled that silence with more work, more frantic, desperate creativity, trying to prove to himself that the sacrifice had been worth it, that the masterpiece he was building would justify the wreckage he had left in his wake. He had friends, or at least, he had had them, but Marcus had a talent for for draining the emotional energy of those around him. His charisma was a bright, blinding light, but it was a light that cast a long, cold shadow. He demanded unwavering belief in his genius, offering little but the fleeting warmth of his attention in return. When the cracks began to show, when the visionary started to look more like a man teetering on the edge, they didn't gather to support him. They had no foundation of mutual support to stand on. One by one, they had drifted away, their whispered sympathies thinly veiling a sense of relief that they were no longer orbiting the sun of his narcissism. His friend Leo, the one person he had considered a true confidant, had called him the night before the Inferno opening. The call had been less a gesture of support and more of a concerned inquiry, a subtle attempt to distance himself. "Just be careful, Marcus," Leo had said, his voice laced with a patronizing pity that had cut Marcus deeper than any cruel review could. "This is a big one. You've been through a lot. Just be careful." The subtext was deafening. Don't embarrass yourself. Don't embarrass me. And then there was the money, or rather, the profound absence of it. The art world is a fickle god, and its offerings can vanish overnight. The lucrative commissions had dried up. The gallery that had been his champion had dropped him from its roster with the cold, clinical efficiency of a corporate downsizing. He had borrowed to fund his projects, convinced his genius would pay it all back. He had mortgaged the future, and now the bill had come due. The phone calls from creditors were a constant, gnawing soundtrack to his days, their voices a chorus of shame and impending doom. His once luxurious loft, the temple to his creativity, was now a prison. He couldn't afford the heating, the windows were drafty, and he had sold the art that had once adorned its walls, stripping it of its character, its soul, until it was a hollow shell that mirrored his own internal state. Standing on that ledge, the city sprawled before him. Marcus felt the crushing weight of it all. It wasn't just a single event. It was the complete, total, and utter collapse of the identity he had spent a lifetime constructing. He was not Marcus Thorne, the visionary artist. He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life. The wind whispered promises of relief, of a final, blessed silence. It would be so easy, one step, just one step, and the noise would stop. The criticism, the debt, the shame, the devastating loneliness, it would all be over. It was a seductive, siren-like call, promising an escape from the agony of existence. He felt a strange, almost peaceful detachment, as he looked down at the tiny, moving cars. The people like ants, their lives so simple and unburdened by the monumental weight he was carrying. He could become a fleeting statistic, a cautionary tale in the evening news, a sad story people would discuss for a moment before moving on with their lives. He thought of his mother. She had been the one who had seen the first flicker of his talent, who had scraped together pennies to buy him his first set of oil paints. She had believed in him with a fierce, unconditional love, a wellspring of support that he had taken for granted and drained dry. When she passed, 5 years ago, he felt a profound loss, but he had buried it in work, in the frantic pursuit of fame. He had never properly mourned her. He had never thanked her properly. He imagined the look on her face if she could see him now, standing on this ledge. It was a thought so painful, so searingly sharp, that it momentarily cut through the fog of his despair. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind. He had not only failed himself, he had failed her. His mind, desperate and chaotic, began to whirl through a montage of his life. He saw the young, hopeful artist he had once been, fresh out of art school, his pockets empty but his heart full of fire. He had moved to this very city, brimming with a naive, beautiful ambition. He saw his first gallery show, a tiny, cramped space where he had sold a single, small painting. The buyer was a middle-aged woman who had said it reminded her of the coast of Maine, where she had spent her summers as a child. The joy he had felt was pure, unadulterated. He hadn't cared about the price, the status, or the reviews. He had connected with another human being. He had made them feel something. That was why he had started. That was the fire that had once burned so brightly. When had the fire been replaced by this cold, calculating, and desperate hunger for validation? When had the act of creation become a frantic race to prove his worth to a world he secretly despised? The answer was a bitter pill to swallow. He had done it to himself. He had lost his way, trading his soul for a seat at a table that didn't care if he lived or died. He had built his entire self-worth on a foundation of sand, fame, money, and critical acclaim. And when the tide of fortune had receded, the entire structure had collapsed, leaving him drowning in the wreckage. This was the most profound moment of his crisis. The easy path, the one-step solution, beckoned with the promise of an end to the pain. It was the path of a victim, a tragic figure who had been beaten by the world. He felt the universe was telling him he didn't belong, that he was a failure, a fraud. But within the crushing weight of that despair, a tiny, almost imperceptible ember of defiance began to glow. It was a fragile thing, a stark contrast to the howling wind and the abyss at his feet. It wasn't hope. Hope was a soft, gentle emotion, a belief in a better tomorrow. This was different. This was a raw, primal, and visceral anger. It was a scream of pure rebellion against the injustice of it all. How dare the world judge him so harshly? How dare these critics, these bankers, these fair weather friends reduce him, Marcus Thorne, to this? He had created things of beauty. He had poured his heart and soul onto canvases. He had made people feel. He had been alive with a passion that most people could only dream of. And they had taken it all. They had taken it, and they had left him with nothing but this. He watched a raindrop splatter on the ledge, then another and another. The storm, which had been holding its breath, finally began to weep. The rain was cold and hard, a baptism of ice that soaked through his coat and plastered his hair to his skull. He was being pelted by the city's tears, or perhaps the city was weeping for him. He didn't know which, but the cold was a shock to his system, a visceral jolt that pushed him to a new level of clarity. The anger, the raw defiance, was building in his chest like a physical pressure, pushing against the suffocating blanket of despair. It wasn't a happy feeling, not by any stretch. It was ugly and acidic, but it was something. It was a pulse. It was a sign that not everything inside him was dead yet. He took a shuddering breath, the air tasting of ozone and asphalt. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of an artist, with long, slender fingers that had once guided the brush with devastating precision. They were now pale, trembling, and raw from the cold. What would they be used for? The question hung in the air. If he jumped, they would be used by the coroner to identify his body. If he stayed, what then? What could these hands possibly build from the ruins of his life? The idea was absurd. The mess was too great. The hole was too deep. He had lost everything, and yet the anger was there. A small, defiant muscle in his chest that refused to relax. It was the same feeling he got when a painting wasn't working, when the colors were wrong and the composition was a disaster. He would get angry. He would not surrender to the canvas. He would scrape off the paint, scream at the wall, and then, when the anger was spent, he would start again. It was his artistic process. It was the only process he knew. And right now, his entire life was a failed painting, a catastrophic mess on a canvas of his own making. He was standing on the edge of the studio, the masterpiece he had failed to create, and the only thing he knew how to do was get angry and start again. But how could he start again? There was no canvas, no paint, no gallery, no money. Everything he had built was gone. The thought was paralyzing. But the anger kept whispering, a relentless, subversive thought in the back of his mind. So what? So what if the canvas was gone? So what if the world had written him off? He was still here. He was still breathing. He was still the man who had created those beautiful, powerful things. They could take his money, his reputation, his friends, and his wife. But could they take that? Could they take the memory of the feeling of creation? Could they take the essence of who he was at his core? The storm intensified, the rain lashing down in sheets, the wind howling like a wounded animal. He was shivering uncontrollably now, his teeth chattering, his body screaming at him to get out of the cold. He took another step back from the edge, his foot scraping against the gritty, rain-slicked concrete. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. It was not a retreat to safety. It was a withdrawal into a deeper, more private battle. He was stepping back from the physical edge to face the even greater void inside himself. He had come up here to die as Marcus Thorne, the man who had failed. But in the crucible of that moment, that man was already dead. The old Marcus, the arrogant, ambitious fame, hungry artist, had been killed by his failures, his debts, and his loneliness. The man who was left on this rooftop was a blank slate, a raw, bleeding wound of a human being. There was nothing left of the old identity to save. The life he had known was over. The death he had been contemplating on the ledge was not a physical one, but a spiritual one. And in a strange, terrifying way, that realization was the most liberating thought he had had in years. The weight of the world was still there. The debt, the shame, the loneliness, they hadn't vanished. But the weight of identity was gone. He no longer had to be the visionary. He no longer had to be the success. He no longer had to be the failure. He was just a man on a rooftop in the rain. And that man had a choice to make. He could surrender to the rain, lie down on the cold, wet concrete, and just wait for the end. Or he could stand up. He could turn his back on the edge and face the impossible task of rebuilding. The anger was now a roaring fire in his gut, a primal force that pushed against the cold and the fear. It was the anger of a cornered animal. It was the refusal to be beaten, to be broken. It was an irrational, almost stupid, belief that he could still fight, even with nothing left to fight with. It was the stubbornness of a man who had been told his whole life he couldn't do something, only to do it anyway. The world had just told him, in the most brutal way possible, that he was nothing, and he was angry enough to prove the world wrong. He looked back at the edge one last time. It was a seductive power, the option to just give in, the ultimate surrender. For a fleeting second, he felt the pull of it again, the promise of sweet, eternal rest. But the anger was stronger. The anger had a new word for that edge. It wasn't a promise of rest. It was cowardice. It was the easy way out. And the one thing Marcus Thorne had never been was a coward. His arrogance, his hubris, his selfishness, they were all sins, all failures of character. But the one thing that had always defined him, his most potent quality, was his defiant will. It was the will that had made him an artist. It was the will that had kept him going, even when his marriage was failing. It was the will that had fought to create something of beauty in a world of chaos. And that will, bruised and battered, was still alive. It was the most terrifying and the most exhilarating realization of his entire life. He was still here, and he was not going to let the world win. He was not going to let the critics, the bankers, or the fair weather friends have the final say. He was going to fight. He didn't know what he was fighting for, or how he was going to fight, but he was going to fight. The anger was his fuel. The defiance was his banner. And the first battle of this new war was to simply survive the night. He had to get off this rooftop. He had to find shelter. He had to get warm. It was the most basic, primal, and necessary first step. It was an act of survival, an act of sheer, stubborn refusal to die. It was the act of the man he was going to have to become. He took a deep, ragged breath and let out a guttural, animalistic roar of pure frustration and defiance into the heart of the storm. The sound was swallowed by the wind, unheard by the world, but it was a declaration of war. He was declaring war on the abyss. He was declaring war on his own despair. He turned his back on the ledge, the city, the storm, and the promise of oblivion. He was shivering, soaked to the bone, and utterly alone. But something in the way he stood was different. His shoulders were squared, his jaw was set, and his eyes, though filled with rain, held a newfound spark of grim, unyielding determination. The fall was complete, the ruin was absolute. But in that ruin, a new foundation was being laid. The decision wasn't to jump, it was to live. It was the first, most brutal, and most essential step in a journey back from the abyss. The old Marcus Thorne had died on that rooftop, not by jumping, but by finally facing the man in the mirror and refusing to be his victim any longer. The real fight, the most brutal and transformative war of his life, was just beginning.